There's a common myth doing the rounds at the moment, the belief that running slow will not make you fast. Let's discover the truth behind this misconception. We'll dive into the importance of building a strong aerobic base, using analogies like car engines to explain the energy system. We'll learn how strategic training can optimize performance and revolutionize your approach to running. Before we look at why you shouldn't only be running fast, let's look at why building a strong aerobic base is so important. Think about an engine of a car. When you're driving your car, if your car has a turbo aspect to it, you don't drive the car in that turbo the entire time, because if you did, your engine would eventually seize. What you like to do is you'd like to drive the car nicely and decent sort of pace, and then every now and then tap into that turbo. And so our training works in a similar sort of way. You want to be building on a strong aerobic base, so think about that as your engine and your anaerobic being the turbo. If we are constantly pushing in the anaerobic, we're going to essentially have our engine seize. We want to get the best out of our engine by working the overall aerobic and only tapping into that turbo every now and then. So what is aerobic-based training? Essentially, how do we get fitter? So we are trying to get ourselves to become more efficient over time. So that is an entire physiological process, from taking oxygen into your body, down into the lungs, letting that oxygen come through the small little alveoli, goes into the bloodstream, and you have red blood cells that then transport oxygen to the cells. Once you're at a cellular level, that oxygen crosses over into the mitochondria in the cells, and the mitochondria are essentially the powerhouses of the cells. That's where our energy gets created and comes from. And from there, that energy is created, and there are a bunch of metabolites that are then created that then need to get taken out, and that essentially comes out in the form of carbon dioxide. So that entire process, we want to become more efficient at doing that. And by training the aerobic system, so by training at an easier sort of pace all the time, you are allowing yourself to make that process become more efficient. The key thing to note here is that energy systems are not an on-off switch. So while I'm using the analogy of the car and the turbo, these things are working at the same time. One perhaps more predominantly, more so than the other, but it's not a flip switch of turning on and turning off the anaerobic and turning on the aerobic. And so it's very, very key that we train predominantly in certain zones, if you will. When we train properly within these specific zones and don't tether too much on the mid or gray zone or random area, we can start to use lactate, which is a byproduct of that whole metabolism system that I spoke about. We can start to use lactate as a fuel source. Before we dive into other strategic training principles that will optimize your running performance, let's dive into why you shouldn't only run slow. Running easy allows you to build a lot more volume, but in order to get a little bit faster, we do have to include some speed or interval type sessions. And so by only running slow, you're not going to necessarily start seeing any improvements within your running. But the key thing is that running easy enough allows you to recover better so that you can do your fast runs even faster. So many athletes we work with are running their easy runs a little bit too hard, so that they land up here towards this gray zone, which means they don't have enough capacity when they're required to do their interval sessions or their hard sessions. So by running more easy, you allow yourself a greater capacity to do your hard sessions as hard as you should be. Again, it's key to reiterate that these energy systems don't work on a black and white line. They are working all the time, but you want to be training in a specific zone or area predominantly more so than the other. The goal of your easy and long run training paces is not to match your race day training pace. By doing that, you're going to be putting a lot of stress and load on the body. Let's look at the marathon as an example, or any endurance event, but particularly the marathon. We essentially have two energy systems that are working predominantly during a marathon. Earlier, I spoke about anaerobic and aerobic. Let's define exactly what those are. One of those systems operates in the absence of oxygen and relies solely on carbohydrates. And the other system operates in the presence of oxygen and creates energy by utilizing carbohydrates, ketones, or fats. It's not a case of necessarily using one versus the other, but in a marathon, we require a highly developed aerobic system. By training more aerobically, we improve the efficiency of energy delivery. As I explained earlier, all of those things happening within the cells. And when we do that, we're able to run at a much higher relative speed. And when we train too close to that anaerobic line, the energy demands that you require mean that you're going to be working on more anaerobic metabolism. So we're tapping a little bit more into that turbo at that point in time. And so the goal here is that we want to build a bigger engine without affecting the turbo. Take my car as an example. My car is a 1 liter with a turbo. It's great. It's very nippy. It does the job. Whereas Lindsay's car is a 1.9 TDI. And so he has a bigger engine and a turbo. So on a long road trip, Lindsay's car is going to beat me way further because he's going to be able to tap into his bigger engine and the turbo every now and then. One of the other reasons why we don't want to run fast all the time is that it puts a lot of eccentric stress on your muscles. What is that? When you're running or when you're doing any activity, your muscles are contracting in a number of different ways, but the two main contractions are concentric contractions and eccentric contractions. When we're running in particular, every time you step off the ground or push off the ground, your muscles are contracting concentrically. So the muscles are coming together, and that is nice and strong. You can see that the muscle fibers pulling together. Every time you land on the ground, there's shock absorbing that happens, and the muscles are still contracting, but the fibers are pulling apart. And so you can see that's just not as strong. And so that will cause a lot more muscle damage every time we step down and have that shock absorbing. And so essentially by running faster all the time, you are doing a lot more muscle damage within each of the fibers. The key here, therefore, is to run your easy and long runs a little bit slower. That is not going to change the effect that that has on your aerobic system, on building your engine, but it's going to take a little bit less wear and tear on that engine over time, which will allow you to recover better between your sessions and therefore be able to do your faster runs, tapping into that turbo really, really well. There are 4 other training principles that will really help you and benefit your running if you implement them with this running your easy and long runs a little bit easier. The first of those is strength training. If you are incorporating strength training into your routine, strength training helps your body to become more fatigue resistant, so you fatigue much later on. The second is good nutrition. If you are giving your body the fuel it needs to create energy, you are then going to be able to go much further for much longer. The third one is utilizing cross training. So that's things like cycling, swimming, rowing ergo, anything where you are building your aerobic base without the loads of running, without that eccentric component that I spoke about earlier. And so cross training allows you to build that aerobic base, that engine, a little bit more without necessarily having the load, because you are able to recover really well between sessions. And that is the fourth aspect, is recovery. If you are able to maximize your recovery between your sessions, you are going to get the best out of each individual session, as opposed to carrying this accumulated fatigue from each session into the next. Now that you've shattered the myth, it's time to put knowledge into action. Remember though, balance is key. This is the incredible story of how our friend went from overweight and sedentary to becoming a 2:41 marathon runner.